Hello and welcome to our virtual neighborhood choir. Did you know that March is Women's History Month? We should always learn about the countless women who have made our world a better place. But March is a good time to give special focus, looking back to the past and recognizing the women who are making history right now. Women have been creating music all throughout history. Today we're going to learn about some important women composers from the past and from today. A composer is a person who writes music. When a lot of us think about composers of classical music, I bet faces like these come to mind. In fact, if you look through a lot of books about the history of music, most of the pictures you will see look like these. Does that mean that people who looked different weren't creating music? Absolutely not. Today, we're going to learn about some women who were amazing composers from the past and some who are creating brilliant music today. To start off, we're going to go all the way back to the Middle Ages. Hildegard von Bingen is the first woman composer that we know about and one of the first composers we know of, period. She was born more than 900 years ago in the year 1098 and lived until 1179. She was an abbess who spent most of her life living with other nuns in a hilltop monastery in Germany. In addition to being a nun, she was an artist, a writer, a philosopher, and a scientist. She left behind more than 80 musical pieces, most of them written for choirs of nuns to sing. She believed that she had a special connection to God through spiritual visions, and that her music and her other art came directly from that connection. Now we'll skip ahead about 400 years to Francesca Caccini. She was an Italian singer, poet, teacher, and played the lute. She was the daughter of a famous Renaissance composer, Giulio Caccini, and became one of the most important female composers in all of Europe. Unfortunately, very little of her music survives today. As far as we know, she wrote the first opera ever written by a woman. Fanny Mendelssohn was a German composer and a piano player who lived from 1805 to 1847. She was the sister of the famous composer Felix Mendelssohn and published some of her music under his name, since people didn't think that women could compose great music at that time. She wrote more than 460 pieces. Most of them were for piano or for piano and a singer. Clara Schumann was one of the most famous pianists of her time. She started touring all over Europe when she was just 11 years old, and she continued to perform for 61 years. She composed songs and pieces for piano, for small instrumental groups, and for choirs. For 150 years, most of her music was never played by anyone else until people started studying, performing, and recording her music about 50 years ago. Teresa Carrerano was also a very famous pianist, along with being a singer and a composer. She was born in Caracas, Venezuela, and about 9 years later, her family came to New York City. She composed about 75 works, mostly for piano. She also got to perform for Abraham Lincoln at the White House in 1863. Today, the Venezuelan Symphony Orchestra plays in a concert hall called the Teresa Carrerano Cultural Complex. Amy Beach wrote the first piano concerto by an American woman and dedicated it to our last composer, Teresa Carrerano. Like Teresa, Amy was both a famous pianist and a composer. She was really the first successful woman composer in America. Her Gaelic symphony was the first symphony composed and published by an American woman. It was first performed by the Boston Symphony Orchestra in 1896. She became one of the most respected and famous American composers, male or female, of her time. Florence Price was a musical prodigy. She gave her first performance on the piano when she was only 4 years old, and her first composition was published when she was only 11. She graduated high school when she was only 14, at the top of her class. And she went on to study music at the New England Conservatory in Boston. There she studied both piano and organ. She became a teacher and the head of the music department at Clark Atlanta University in Georgia. She wrote hundreds of musical pieces, including symphonies and other works for orchestra and small instrumental ensembles, music for choirs and solo singers, music for piano, organ, and much more. She became the first African American woman to have a composition played by a major orchestra. One of her music students and close friends was another African American woman composer named Margaret Bonds. Margaret Bonds wrote her first music piece called Marquette Street Blues when she was only 5 years old. Her mother was her first piano teacher, but she took composition lessons with Florence Price while she was still in school. She lived in Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles and studied piano and composition at Northwestern University. As a singer, she was the first Black soloist to perform with the Chicago Symphony at the Chicago World's Fair in 1933. She also had a career as a pianist and performed Florence Price's piano concerto in 1934. In 1965, she wrote the piece Montgomery Variations for orchestra and dedicated it to Martin Luther King Jr. Today, she's most remembered for her arrangements of African American spirituals and for setting a lot of poems by Langston Hughes. Jennifer Higdon is one of America's most famous living composers. She started music late, teaching herself to play the flute at age 15. She studied flute performance at Bowling Green State University, but struggled a bit because she didn't have much training before going to college. Her flute teacher encouraged her to try composition, and she wrote her first composition during college. She went on to study at one of the best schools for music, the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia. And now she's a teacher there. She has written music for many of the best orchestras and wrote her first opera in 2015 for Opera Philadelphia and Santa Fe Opera. Her works have been performed all over the world with several hundred performances a year and over 48 recordings. She's won the Pulitzer Prize and has 3 Grammy Awards. Gabriella Lin Frank was included in the Washington Post list of the 35 most important women composers in all of history. She was born in Berkeley, California in 1972. Her mother's family comes from Peru and China, and her father is of Lithuanian Jewish descent. Despite being hearing impaired, Gabriella excelled in music. She studied piano and composition at Rice University and the University of Michigan. Gabriella uses music to explore her multicultural background, especially her mother's Peruvian heritage. She's traveled throughout South America, and she uses Latin American folklore, poetry, mythology, and musical styles in her compositions. She's been hired to write music for many of the best orchestras and musical ensembles and has won lots of awards. In 2017, she founded her own school, the Gabriella Lin Frank Creative Academy of Music, so young composers can have the opportunity to work with famous performers. Angelica Negron was born in 1981 in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and now she lives in Brooklyn, New York. As a child, she studied piano and violin at the Conservatory of Music in Puerto Rico, and then she went to New York University and the City University of New York. Now she teaches young children about composing and helped create a Spanish immersion music program for young children. She has written pieces for orchestra, small groups, soloists, singers, ballets, and film music. She incorporates some unusual sounds and instruments into her music, like accordions, robotic instruments, toys, and electronics. She recently wrote a lip-sync opera that explored the ideas of fantasy and illusion. Just like Angelica, Jessie Montgomery was born in 1981. She's a violinist, composer, and music educator from New York City. She was born and raised in New York by parents working in music and theater. She went to one of the most famous music schools in the world, the Juilliard School, for violin. She also got a master's degree in composition for film from New York University. She performs and gives workshops all around the world, and her music is being performed all over the country. The Washington Post said her music is exploding with life. Since 1999, she's worked with the Sphinx organization, which supports young African American and Latinx string players. As you can see, today there are more women in music than ever before. We got to learn about 8 composers from the past and 4 who are writing music right now, but there are so many more. For lots of reasons, women composers didn't get the attention that they deserved throughout most of history. As we dig deeper, we learn more and more about the women who created music when society was telling them it was a man's job. Today, we're seeing a lot more women become famous composers in classical music. I hope you take some time to search on YouTube to hear some music by these incredible composers. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you've been inspired by the stories of these women composers. Who knows? Maybe some of our friends watching this episode will decide to become a composer. Remember, all of us can make beautiful music.